My name is Camille Ashford. I'm 34, and for the last 10 years I've worked as a prenatal care coordinator at Riverside Medical Center. The person who sits with expectant parents through ultrasounds, high-risk consults, and the particular kind of waiting room silence that comes right before a doctor delivers news that will change a family forever. I know how to read a room bracing for bad news the way other people read weather. So when my own mother-in-law stood up at my baby shower, 6 weeks before my due date, and announced to 40 of my closest friends and family that my husband had another baby on the way too, I watched every face in that room brace for my collapse. I didn't collapse. I already knew. I remember the exact texture of that room in the seconds after she said it, 40 faces turning toward me at once. My sister's phone still recording from the gift table, the pale pink balloon arch behind Marilyn swaying slightly from the air conditioning. I sat there with both hands resting on my 7 months pregnant belly, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel in that moment. Not devastation, but a strange, steady stillness, the same stillness I use professionally when a family is about to receive news I already know is coming before the doctor even opens their mouth. Welcome back to the channel. If you've ever had someone try to destroy you in public with information they thought you didn't have, this story is for you. Before I tell you exactly what I said in that room, and exactly what I'd already done in the 6 weeks leading up to it, drop a comment with your city and what time it is where you're watching. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe to the channel. I read every comment. Let me take you back to where this actually started, because you need to understand the shape of this family long before you understand the shape of what my mother-in-law did at that shower. I want to tell you a little about the job itself before I go further, because it matters for understanding how I processed everything that came later. I chose prenatal coordination after watching my own younger sister go through a difficult, frightening pregnancy in her 20s, one where nobody on her care team seemed able to explain in plain language what was actually happening to her body or her baby. I built my entire career around being the person in the room who translates fear into information, who sits with a family in the space between a concerning scan and a doctor's full explanation, and who has learned across a decade of that work that the families who cope best are almost never the ones who react fastest. They're the ones who gather every piece of information available before they let themselves fully feel any of it. I didn't realize until this all happened to me directly how completely that professional instinct would end up protecting me in my own personal life. I met Ryan Pierce 8 years ago at a continuing education conference for medical sales representatives, where he was working a booth for a device company and I was there representing my hospital's labor and delivery unit for a supplier demonstration. He was easy to talk to in the specific way people who sell things for a living are easy to talk to. But underneath that polish, there was something that felt genuinely warm, and for the first 2 years I dated him, I believed that warmth all the way down. We married 5 years ago in a small ceremony at a vineyard 40 minutes outside the city, 110 guests, my parents beaming through the whole thing. Ryan's mother Marilyn seated in the front row in a pale blue dress, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that I would later understand, with the benefit of hindsight, was not entirely for the reasons I assumed at the time. I remember one moment from our wedding day itself that I filed away at the time as nothing more than an odd little aside. During the reception, while Ryan and I were making our way around the tables, Marilyn pulled me aside near the bar and said, squeezing my hand, "I just want you to know, I've made my peace with all of this." I thanked her, assuming she meant something generic about weddings and change, and it wasn't until years later, turning that sentence over in my memory, that I understood she likely meant something considerably more specific. A peace she'd apparently had to actively work toward rather than simply feel. Ryan dated a woman named Brooke Ainsley for 3 years in college, a relationship that ended, by his own account, amicably when they graduated and took jobs in different cities. I met Brooke exactly twice before my wedding, both times at Pierce family gatherings, both times introduced by Marilyn with a warmth that felt, even then, slightly disproportionate to the occasion. Brooke practically grew up in this family, Marilyn told me once, early in my relationship with Ryan, in a tone that seemed designed less to explain history and more to establish a hierarchy I hadn't realized I was being measured against. I laughed it off at the time. Most people, I think, would have. Marilyn Pierce has never disliked me openly. I want to be precise about that because it matters for understanding exactly how she operates. Marilyn's preferred method across the 14 years I've known her has been comparison rather than confrontation. At our first Thanksgiving as a married couple, she served a green bean casserole and mentioned to the table at large that it was Brooke's recipe. One Brooke had shared with her years earlier, a detail nobody at that table needed to know except, I think, me. I spent the first 3 years of my marriage absorbing these small, precise comparisons the way you absorb weather, telling myself they were simply the harmless habits of a woman who struggled to let go of an old family favorite, rather than what I now understand them to have been. A woman who never actually accepted that her son had married someone other than the person she'd already chosen for him. I learned much later, piecing together fragments from Grace over the years, some of the history behind that attachment. Marilyn had gone through her own difficult divorce from Ryan's father when Ryan was in high school, a period during which Brooke's mother, a close friend of Marilyn's from church, had been one of the few people who stayed reliably present for her. Brooke, by extension, spent considerable time around the Pierce household during those turbulent years, and Marilyn had apparently, in Grace's words, basically adopted her a little bit, the way you do with a kid who's around during the hardest years of your life. I don't say this to excuse what came later, but I do think it explains something about why Marilyn's attachment to Brooke was never really about Ryan's romantic happiness at all. It was about a version of stability Marilyn had built for herself during her own crisis, one she apparently never fully let go of, even after her son moved on and built an entirely different life. There was another moment, 2 years into my marriage, that I think about more now than I did at the time. Ryan and I hosted Christmas at our house for the first time, and I spent weeks planning it carefully, wanting to establish our own traditions rather than simply inheriting his family's. Marilyn arrived, looked around the living room, and said with real warmth in her voice, "This is lovely," though Brooke always did have such a gift for making a house feel like a home. I remember standing in my own doorway, in my own home, being measured against a woman who had never once lived in it. Ryan, standing beside me, laughed it off as just mom being mom, a phrase he used often enough over the years that I eventually stopped expecting him to say anything else. I want to tell you about the year Ryan and I found out we were expecting, because it matters for what happened later. We tried for 2 years before we conceived. 2 years that included one early miscarriage I still think about more than I let on. And when we finally got a positive test 8 months ago, I remember calling Marilyn with genuine excitement, wanting, even after everything, for her to share in it the way I imagined a grandmother should. Her first response, before congratulations, before asking how I was feeling, was to ask whether we knew yet if it was a boy, because in her words, Ryan's side has always wanted a boy first. I told her we didn't know yet. She said she had a feeling it would be, the way she always seemed to have a feeling about things that confirmed whatever she already wanted to believe. My pregnancy became high risk in my second trimester, when a routine ultrasound showed a low-lying placenta close enough to my cervix to require monitoring, and, eventually, 4 weeks of modified bed rest starting around week 20. I want you to understand what that month looked like from the inside, because it matters enormously for what I'm about to tell you. I was working part-time from our living room couch, terrified every time I stood up too quickly, tracking every twinge and cramp with the same clinical precision I use professionally. Except now the patient was myself, and the stakes were the baby I'd waited 2 years and 1 loss to carry. Ryan was, on the surface, attentive during that stretch. He brought me water. He rearranged his travel schedule. He told me to be home more. I believed every part of that arrangement because I had no reason yet not to. I want to be honest about how frightening that month actually was, beyond the logistics of bed rest itself. I spent my days Googling placenta previa outcomes late at night when Ryan thought I was asleep, terrified of a bleed that could send me to the hospital with no warning, calculating, obsessively. How many more weeks? I needed the placenta to migrate before my daughter would be considered safely viable if anything went wrong early. I remember telling Ryan one night that I was scared, genuinely scared, in a way I rarely let myself say out loud, even to him, and I remember him holding me and telling me everything would be fine. A sentence that, months later, I would turn over in my mind wondering how he managed to say it so convincingly, while apparently building an entirely separate life 2 states away at the exact same time. If you've ever built your entire understanding of a marriage on a version of your partner you assumed was consistent everywhere, I want you to hear this next part carefully, because it's the part that took me the longest to fully accept myself. Ryan's job required regional travel roughly 1 week out of every month, calling on hospital systems across a 3-state territory, A rhythm that had been part of our marriage since before we were married at all, and one I had never once questioned because his territory reports, his expense patterns, and his call schedule had always lined up cleanly with what he told me. During my month of bed rest, that travel didn't stop. If anything, it increased slightly, which Ryan explained as a temporary product coverage gap left by a colleague's medical leave. A detail that, at the time, felt entirely plausible and entirely unremarkable. What I didn't know and wouldn't know for another 2 months is that somewhere in the middle of that bed rest stretch, while I was lying on our living room couch tracking my own baby's movements out of fear that I might lose her, Ryan reconnected with Brooke Ainsley at a conference in a city 2 states away, a reconnection that Marilyn, I would later learn, had quietly encouraged for months, in ways so subtle I never once registered them as encouragement until I understood the full pattern behind them. I want to sit with the specific cruelty of that timing for a moment, because I don't think I fully processed it until months later. While I was lying on my own couch, terrified of losing our daughter before she was even viable, doing everything my doctors asked of me, refusing even to walk to the mailbox without calling Ryan first out of caution. My husband was in another state, at a conference he'd told me was simply part of his usual work rhythm, beginning something that would eventually produce another child entirely. There's a specific kind of betrayal in learning that the exact weeks you spent most afraid, most vulnerable, most dependent on your partner's steadiness were also the weeks he chose to build something else. I don't think I have fully forgiven that timing, even now, separate from everything else. I found out I was expecting a girl at my 20-week anatomy scan, the same appointment that flagged the placenta issue, and I remember lying on that table feeling 2 enormous things collide inside me at once. Relief at finally knowing and fear about everything the ultrasound tech's careful, professional silence around the placenta measurement seemed to suggest before the doctor even came in to explain it fully. I called Marilyn that evening to tell her the baby was a girl. There was a pause on the line long enough that I noticed it even through the phone. "Well," she finally said, "I suppose that's still wonderful news," in a tone that made clear, without a single additional word, exactly whose preference had not been met. Ryan's reaction, by contrast, was everything I'd hoped for in that moment. Genuine excitement, tears he didn't try to hide, an immediate phone call to his own father to share the news. I remember feeling grateful in that moment that at least one Pierce in this family seemed capable of meeting me with the joy the occasion deserved. I didn't yet know, of course, that the same man crying happy tears over our daughter's ultrasound photo had, by that point, already spent several weeks building a connection with someone else that would eventually complicate everything about the family he was so visibly thrilled to be building with me. If this story is landing for you already, I want you to know it gets considerably stranger before it gets better. Let me tell you about the 4 months between that ultrasound and the day everything came apart, because those 4 months contain almost everything you need to understand about how a family can build an entire second life around you without your ever once noticing the architecture of it. The first thing I noticed, in hindsight, was how often Marilyn began mentioning Brooke again, casually, at nearly every phone call and family dinner, over a period of roughly 4 months. "I ran into Brooke at the farmer's market," she'd say, or "Brooke's design business is doing so well. She just finished a beautiful project downtown." Dropped into conversation the way you might mention any old family friend, except Brooke had not, to my knowledge, been mentioned even once in the 2 years prior. I asked Ryan once, mildly, whether his mother and Brooke had gotten close again. He shrugged and said something about his mother staying in touch with a lot of people from his college years, a sentence that felt, at the time, like a complete and reasonable answer. I want to be fair to myself here, because I've replayed those 4 months enough times to wonder whether I should have caught on sooner. I was, during that entire stretch, deeply consumed with my own body's uncertainty, tracking fetal movement counts, attending twice-weekly monitoring appointments, and trying to simply get through each day without triggering another bleed. I had very little emotional bandwidth left over for parsing the subtext of my mother-in-law's small talk. I think that's precisely why this worked as long as it did. Nobody builds an entire second life around someone by being dramatic about it. They build it in the space created by that person's genuine, understandable distraction. The second thing, which I only pieced together much later using our joint credit card statements, was a pattern of hotel charges in a city 2 states north, a city where Ryan's territory did include 2 hospital accounts, but where he had historically stayed no more than 1 night per visit, roughly every 6 weeks. Beginning around the start of my bed rest month, those visits became 2 nights instead of one, occurring closer to every 3 weeks instead of 6. At the time, I noticed the statements only in the vague, half-attentive way most people notice recurring bills, filing the increased frequency under the same explanation Ryan had already given me: a temporary coverage gap requiring more travel. The third thing, and the one that still unsettles me the most in retrospect, happened at a family barbecue at Marilyn's house roughly 2 months before my due date, an event I attended 7 months pregnant, uncomfortable and increasingly anxious about my own upcoming delivery. Marilyn had, without mentioning it to me beforehand, invited Brooke, introducing her to a cluster of extended family members I didn't recognize as an old family friend, practically one of our own. I remember Brooke being perfectly pleasant to me that afternoon, asking about my due date, my hospital, my birth plan, questions that felt, at the time, like ordinary small talk between two women in a shared social circle. I did not yet understand that Brooke was asking those questions with a considerably more specific interest in the answers than I could have imagined. At one point that afternoon, Ryan crossed the yard to bring me a plate of food, and I remember Brooke's eyes following him the entire way, a look I registered at the time as nothing more than the natural attention you'd pay to someone you used to know well. Looking back, I understand that look completely differently. She wasn't watching an old college boyfriend catch up with a pregnant wife. She was watching a man who by that point had already been sharing a bed with her for nearly 2 months carry a plate of potato salad to the woman he still hadn't told either of us the full truth about. I want to describe one more incident from that barbecue because I think about it often now. At one point, gathering plates in Marilyn's kitchen, I overheard her telling a cousin, in a lowered voice she clearly didn't expect me to be close enough to catch: "Some things just have a way of working themselves out eventually, the way they were always supposed to." I remember standing in that kitchen doorway feeling a small, cold prickle of unease I couldn't yet name, the specific sensation of hearing a sentence that clearly meant something to the person saying it, without yet having the context to understand what. There was a fourth thing, one I only recognized in hindsight as significant, that happened roughly 6 weeks before my due date. Ryan's phone rang during dinner and he stepped into the other room to take it, which wasn't unusual given his job, except that when he came back, he mentioned, almost too casually, that it had been a work thing about the Ainsley Project, a phrase that meant nothing to me at the time because I had no reason to connect the word Ainsley to anything beyond a coincidence. I know now there was no Ainsley Project. There was only Brooke Ainsley, and a husband who had apparently gotten comfortable enough in his own house to let her name slip into a sentence he assumed I'd never think twice about. There was a fifth thing, too, smaller than the rest, that I only understood in hindsight. Ryan started going to the gym more frequently in those final months, 4 mornings a week instead of his usual 2. A change he attributed to wanting to get in better shape before the baby comes. I remember being pleased by it at the time, even proud of him for the discipline. I understand now that a man beginning an affair often develops a sudden, urgent interest in his own appearance, and that I had simply filed the most obvious kind of red flag under the most flattering possible explanation, because I had no reason yet to look for anything else. Here's what I know now, pieced together over the following weeks from bank statements: a single accidental text notification, and one deeply uncomfortable conversation with Ryan himself. Ryan and Brooke had, in fact, reconnected at that out-of-state conference during my bed rest month. An initial conversation that Ryan would later describe, with what I can only call remarkable dishonesty even in the act of confessing, as just catching up. A catching up that became a physical relationship within roughly 3 weeks and continued, with increasing frequency over the following 4 months. Brooke discovered she was pregnant 9 weeks before my own due date, roughly 12 weeks into her own pregnancy, meaning that for a period of nearly 2 months, my husband knew that both his wife and the woman he was having an affair with were carrying his children at the same time, a fact he chose to sit with in silence rather than disclose to either of us. If you've ever discovered that an entire second timeline of your own life was unfolding without you, I want you to tell me about it in the comments, because I don't think people talk about how disorienting that specific kind of betrayal actually is. Now let me tell you exactly how I found out, because the way I found out changed everything about how calmly I was able to handle what came next. I found out on a Tuesday evening 5 weeks before my due date, sitting on our couch scrolling through our shared family photo album on my tablet, an account Ryan and I had set up years earlier to share pictures. with both sets of grandparents without needing separate group texts. A notification popped up from a linked messaging thread that had somehow synced to the shared account through a settings error neither of us had ever noticed. A preview of a text from a contact saved simply as B, reading, 12-week scan went perfectly. They said everything looks great, due date confirmed for March 14th. I sat with that notification for what felt like a very long time before I understood. With the specific clinical clarity my job has trained into me over a decade of reading ultrasound reports. Exactly what a 12-week scan and a confirmed due date actually meant, and exactly how far back the timeline needed to stretch to make both of those numbers true. Ryan was upstairs during all of this, folding laundry, humming something from the radio, entirely unaware that the version of our marriage he'd been maintaining for months had just quietly ended on a couch 15 feet below him. I remember looking up at the ceiling, listening to him move around our bedroom, and feeling a strange, almost clinical detachment settle over me. The same detachment I use when I have to walk into a room and tell a family their scan showed something they weren't expecting. I did not cry that night, not because I wasn't devastated, but because some deeper, more practical part of me understood immediately. Immediately. But because I wasn't devastated, but because some deeper, more practical part of me understood immediately. Understood. No proof. That crying would need to wait until I'd secured everything I could control first. I did not confront Ryan that night. I want to be honest about why. 10 years of coordinating prenatal care has taught me that the worst possible moment to gather complete information is the moment you're standing in the middle of the most emotionally overwhelming version of it, and 5 weeks from my own due date, 7 months pregnant, alone with a notification that had just detonated my entire understanding of my marriage, was about as emotionally overwhelming a moment as I could imagine. I closed the tablet. I went to bed early, telling Ryan I wasn't feeling well, which was, in its own way, entirely true. Over the following 4 days, I did something I had never once done in 5 years of marriage. I pulled every joint credit card statement going back 6 months, cross-referencing hotel charges against Ryan's reported travel schedule, and found exactly what I'd started to suspect: a pattern of extended stays in the same city, at increasing frequency, beginning almost precisely at the start of my bed rest month. I called a colleague from nursing school who now worked labor and delivery at a hospital in that same city, someone I trusted completely, and asked carefully, without explaining why, whether she happened to know an interior designer named Brooke Ainsley who might be a patient there. She did know her, slightly, through a mutual friend, and confirmed, without my needing to ask directly, that Brooke was indeed expecting, due sometime in mid-March. I sat with that confirmation the same way I sit with a difficult ultrasound finding before I deliver it to a family, absorbing the full weight of it privately before I said a single word out loud to anyone else. I want to be careful here about exactly how I verified that pregnancy, because I never once accessed anything through my own hospital system to do it. I would never use my professional access to pull a stranger's medical information, and I didn't need to. My colleague knew Brooke socially through an entirely separate connection, and what she confirmed came from ordinary conversation, not from any chart or record either of us had any right to look at. I want that distinction to be clear because the whole rest of this story depends on the fact that everything I built over those 5 weeks came from public records. Joint financial statements I had every legal right to review, and information people offered me voluntarily, nothing more. If you're the kind of person who processes a crisis by quietly gathering every fact before you react, I want you to know I see you, and I'd love to hear how you've handled something like this yourself in the comments. Now, let me tell you what I did in the 5 weeks between that discovery and my own baby shower, because it is the calmest, most deliberate 5 weeks of my entire life, and it is the only reason I was able to sit through what happened at that shower without falling apart in front of 40 people. I called a family law attorney named Denise Okafor 3 days after confirming Brooke's due date, a referral from a friend who'd gone through her own difficult divorce 2 years earlier. I sat in Denise's office, 7 months pregnant, and laid out everything I knew. The credit card pattern, the text notification, the confirmed due date, the barbecue conversation I'd overheard, and asked her one question. I'm about to give birth in 5 weeks. What do I need to have in place before that happens, regardless of what I decide to do about the marriage itself? Denise was direct with me in a way I needed at that moment more than sympathy. You need a paternity and custody framework established the moment your daughter is born, not after, she said. You need our state's parentage documentation filed correctly so there's no ambiguity about your daughter's legal father regardless of what happens in this marriage. And you need your own financial accounts separated from any joint accounts that might get complicated by a second family's claims down the road, though I'll tell you now. This other child has no legal claim to anything of yours or your daughter's ever, regardless of how this unfolds. I asked her honestly whether I should confront Ryan immediately. She was quiet for a moment. That depends entirely on what protects you and your daughter best over the next 5 weeks. Sometimes the strongest position is the one where you already know everything and they don't yet know that you do. I went back to see Denise a second time, 4 days later, with the credit card statements fully organized and a written timeline I'd built myself. The same way I build a timeline for a patient's chart, dated and specific rather than emotional. Denise reviewed it carefully and told me something that stuck with me more than almost anything else she said that month. Most of my clients come to me already in crisis, reacting to something that just happened an hour ago. You're building a record before you've even said a word to him. That's going to matter enormously if this ever needs to go in front of a judge, but honestly, I think it's going to matter just as much for how steady you're able to stay through whatever happens next in this family. Whether that's in a courtroom or at a dinner table. I didn't fully understand what she meant by a dinner table until the afternoon of my baby shower. But I've thought about that sentence often since. I took her advice seriously. Over the following 2 weeks, I quietly separated a modest personal savings account I'd maintained since before my marriage. In short, our home mortgage and my health insurance were both structured in ways Denise confirmed protected me regardless of what came next, and had Denise draft, though not yet file, the initial paperwork for both the legal separation and the parentage documentation for my daughter. I did all of this without saying a single word to Ryan, not because I intended to blindside him cruelly, but because I had learned, watching my own high-risk pregnancy teach me exactly this lesson, that the safest position in any uncertain situation is the one where you've already secured what you can control before anyone else gets to decide it for you. I want to say one more thing about Denise, because her advice shaped nearly every decision I made during those 5 weeks. She told me, during our second meeting, that she'd seen plenty of clients in similar situations spend their entire remaining pregnancy consumed by anger, unable to focus on anything else, and that the ones who came out the other side steadiest were almost always the ones who gave themselves permission to compartmentalize, to handle the practical pieces methodically during the day and grieve privately, on their own schedule at night. I followed that advice as closely as I could. It didn't make the anger disappear. It just meant the anger never got to choose when or how I showed it. I told Ryan I knew, finally, 11 days before my due date, sitting at our own kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, the full folder Denise and I had built laid out in front of me. I watched him go through 3 distinct stages in about 90 seconds. Denial, a weak attempt at minimizing what I already clearly knew everything about. And then, finally, a kind of collapsed honesty that told me, more than anything he actually said, exactly how long he'd been carrying this. "How long have you known?" he asked, and I told him. He asked whether I was going to tell his mother. I told him that wasn't a decision I needed to make, because I was fairly confident his mother already knew considerably more than either of us realized. Ryan asked me, near the end of that conversation, whether I still loved him, a question that surprised me with how genuinely he seemed to want an honest answer rather than reassurance. I told him the truth, that I didn't know yet, that grief and love were sitting in the same space in me at that moment, and I hadn't sorted out which one was going to win. He nodded, and for a moment some of the performative composure he'd carried through the rest of the conversation dropped away entirely. And he just looked briefly, like a man who understood exactly how much he'd broken and had no real plan for how to fix it. I didn't find that moment satisfying the way I might have expected to. I mostly just found it sad for both of us and for a daughter who was about to be born into whatever came next. That conversation, it turns out, was more prophetic than I understood at the time. What I did not yet know, sitting at that kitchen table 11 days before my due date, was that Marilyn had known about Brooke's pregnancy for nearly 6 weeks by then. Ever since Brooke, treating Marilyn as something closer to an actual mother-in-law than I think either of them ever fully acknowledged out loud, had called her directly with the news. And what I did not know until the afternoon of my own baby shower was exactly what Marilyn had decided to do with that information. If you've ever had someone in your family choose the worst possible moment to reveal something they'd known for weeks, I want you to tell me about it. Because I think this happens more often in families that already run on comparison and favoritism than anyone likes to admit. Now let me tell you exactly what happened in that room, because it did not go even remotely the way Marilyn had planned. Denise called me that morning, the morning of the shower, just to check in, one final time, before the day got underway. "Whatever anyone says today," she reminded me, "the paperwork protecting you and your daughter is already filed and ready to go the moment she's born. Nothing said out loud today changes any of that." I sat with that reassurance for a while after we hung up, sitting on the edge of my bed, one hand resting on my belly, feeling my daughter shift beneath my palm. I had no idea that morning exactly what Marilyn intended to do at that shower. I only knew, walking into it, that I had already secured everything within my power to secure, and that whatever happened next, I would be facing it from steadier ground than anyone in that room could have guessed. My baby shower was held at my sister's house. 40 guests, pastel decorations, a dessert table my mother had spent 2 days preparing. The specific kind of gathering built entirely around celebrating a baby who, by that point, I already understood was walking into a family more complicated than anyone in that room yet realized. Marilyn arrived early, unusually warm, complimenting the decorations, the cake, my dress, in a register of enthusiasm I now recognize, in hindsight, as the specific energy of a woman anticipating a moment she'd been quietly rehearsing. The moment arrived during the gift-opening portion of the afternoon, after I'd unwrapped perhaps a dozen presents, sitting in a decorated chair at the center of the room while my sister recorded video for my mother's side of the family who couldn't attend. Marilyn stood up from her seat near the dessert table, tapping her glass with a spoon in a gesture that immediately silenced the room, the universal signal for an announcement. "I know this is Camille's day," she began, "but I think, as a family, we need to be honest with each other, especially now, with a new baby coming." I felt the room's attention shift toward her, 40 faces turning. My sister's phone still recording, capturing, I would later realize, every single second of what came next. "Ryan has another baby on the way too," Marilyn said, her voice carrying the particular, deliberate clarity of someone who has rehearsed a sentence enough times that it comes out steady even under pressure. "With Brooke. I think everyone deserves to know the truth before this family gets any bigger." I want to describe the room in that moment as honestly as I can, because I think the image matters more than almost anything else in the story. 40 faces turned toward me in the specific, frozen way people's faces turn when they're bracing to witness someone's collapse. My mother's hand flying to her mouth, my sister lowering her phone slightly, Ryan seated beside me, going the color of the tablecloth. Every single person in that room was waiting for me to break. I didn't break. I sat with my hands folded over my 7 months pregnant belly, and I let the silence stretch for exactly as long as I needed it to before I answered. The same measured pause I use in a delivery room right before I deliver difficult news to a family. Because I have learned, across a decade of that work, that silence held with intention lands very differently than silence held out of shock. "I know, Marilyn," I finally said, my voice level. "I've known for 5 weeks." The room's collective breath seemed to catch all at once. Marilyn's expression, which had been braced for tears or hysteria, faltered visibly, recalibrating in real time. "You knew," she repeated, and I could hear, underneath the 2 words, the sound of a carefully planned moment falling apart before her eyes. "I found out the same way most people find these things out," I said. "Not from either of you being honest with me, but by accident 5 weeks ago. I've spent those 5 weeks with a family law attorney, making sure my daughter's legal parentage and my own financial protections were fully in place before she's even born. Because I didn't know what either of you might decide to do once you realized I knew." I looked at Ryan, whose eyes were fixed on the table in front of him. "What I didn't expect," I continued, turning back to Marilyn, "was that you'd choose my baby shower in front of my entire family to be the one to announce it, rather than telling me privately at any point over the last 6 weeks that you've apparently known." Marilyn's composure cracked into something sharper. "I thought you deserved to know the truth," she said, though her voice had lost the rehearsed steadiness from a moment earlier. "You thought I deserved to find out in the cruelest possible way, in front of everyone who loves me on a day meant to celebrate my daughter." I said, "Those aren't the same thing, Marilyn. And I think some part of you has always known that." The same way some part of you has spent 5 years telling me about Brooke's recipes and Brooke's style and Brooke's business, waiting for exactly this moment to finally say her name the way you actually meant it all along. Marilyn's chin lifted, some of her composure returning as defensiveness. I have known Brooke since she was practically a child, she said. She has been part of this family longer than you have in some ways. I don't think it's unreasonable for people to know the truth about who's actually having Ryan's children. I let that sentence sit in the room for a moment. The way I let a difficult diagnosis sit with a family before I respond to the part of it that isn't actually about medicine. Then you should have told me that 6 weeks ago, privately, the way any reasonable person tells a daughter-in-law something that affects her marriage, I said. You didn't do that because privately, I might have had time to prepare a response you didn't get to witness. You wanted an audience, Marilyn. That's not honesty. That's a performance. Near the dessert table, one of my mother's oldest friends, a woman named Eileen who had known me since childhood, set down her plate and said, quietly but audibly enough for much of the room to hear, in 40 years of attending baby showers, I have never once seen anything like this. It wasn't directed at anyone specifically, but it landed, and I watched several guests around her nod in the particular silent agreement of people who have just watched something they'll be describing to others for years. My sister-in-law, Grace, Ryan's own younger sister, who had been sitting near the back of the room, stood up slowly, her face pale. Mom, she said quietly, did you know about this for weeks and say nothing to Camille? Marilyn didn't answer her directly, which was, in its own way, an answer. Grace looked at me, then at her brother, and said, I'm so sorry. I had no idea any of this was happening, and I believed her because Grace had never once, in 5 years, treated me the way Marilyn had. Ryan finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes fixed somewhere on the tablecloth rather than on me or his mother. Camille, He stopped, seemingly unable to find a sentence that could follow those 2 words in front of an audience of 40 people. And I watched him glance briefly at his mother with an expression that looked less like anger and more like a man realizing, in real time, that she had just detonated a bomb he'd been quietly trying to defuse in private for 11 days. You don't need to say anything to me right now, Ryan, I said. You've had 5 weeks to say something to me privately, and you didn't. I'm not interested in doing this in front of 40 people either, even though your mother apparently was. I did not ask anyone to leave. I did not raise my voice, though every part of me had wanted to for 5 weeks. I simply asked my sister to bring out the cake, because my daughter was still 6 weeks away from being born into whatever this family actually was, and I was not going to let Marilyn's timing dictate whether the rest of that afternoon belonged to her or to me. The room, stunned into a kind of careful, quiet politeness, slowly resumed something resembling normalcy, though Marilyn left less than 20 minutes later, and Ryan sat beside me in a silence that lasted the rest of the party. My mother found me in the kitchen a few minutes later, ostensibly to help plate the cake, though I understood it was really an excuse to check on me privately. She hugged me tightly and whispered, "How are you even standing right now?" I told her the truth, that I'd had 5 weeks to prepare for a version of this moment, though I hadn't expected it to happen quite like this. She pulled back and looked at me carefully. "You didn't even flinch," she said. "I flinched enough for both of us," I told her, which made her laugh, briefly. In the exhausted way you laugh at something that isn't really funny but needs an outlet anyway. I think, too, about Eileen's comment at the dessert table, the one about 40 years of baby showers. I didn't know it at the time, but she apparently repeated that line to my mother again weeks later, telling her she still thought about it often. Not because of the scandal itself, but because of how the rest of the room had reacted once the initial shock passed. The way people quietly rallied around steadiness rather than drama. I don't know if that's exactly how it looked from the outside. I only know how it felt from where I was sitting, which was simply that I had already done the hardest part of that afternoon 5 weeks earlier. Alone, at my kitchen table, long before anyone else in that room knew there was anything to prepare for at all. We drove home separately that evening, Ryan following in his own car because I told him, plainly, that I needed the drive alone. He came to the house an hour after I did, and we sat at our kitchen table again. The same table where I'd first shown him the folder 11 days earlier. And this time the conversation was less about what had happened and more about what came next. I told him the parentage paperwork Denise had drafted would be filed the moment our daughter was born, that I intended to move forward with a legal separation regardless of anything he said that night, and that whatever relationship he built with his mother going forward was his decision to make, not mine to manage. My parents, who had been at the shower, called me later that night, both of them on the line together, my mother in tears, my father quieter but clearly furious on my behalf. I told them what I'd already put in place over the previous 5 weeks, and I remember my father, a man who rarely offers unsolicited praise, saying simply, "I don't know how you sat through that so calmly. I could barely stay in my seat." I told him the calm wasn't an accident. It was 5 weeks of work, and it was the only thing that got me through that room without giving Marilyn the reaction she'd clearly been hoping for. My daughter was born 11 days later, 5 days past my original due date, 7 pounds 2 ounces. And the first legal document filed on her behalf, 3 days after her birth, was the parentage confirmation Denise and I had prepared weeks in advance. Ryan was in the delivery room. I want to be honest about that because this story isn't about erasing him from his daughter's life, only about refusing to let him or his mother decide the terms of what came before it. Brooke gave birth to a son 8 weeks after my daughter was born. I don't know the details of their arrangement, and I've made a deliberate choice not to ask because it is no longer, in any sense, my responsibility to track. Ryan and I finalized our separation 4 months after that baby shower, a process Denise handled cleanly, given how much groundwork had already been laid before either of us said a single confrontational word to each other. Marilyn and I have not spoken since that afternoon, save for one phone call 2 weeks later. I spoke with Marilyn exactly once more, roughly 2 weeks after the shower, when she called asking to see my daughter. I told her, as gently and as firmly as I could manage, that I needed considerably more time before I could imagine her having any role in my daughter's life, given how she'd chosen to handle everything. She didn't apologize, not directly. She said instead, "I only ever wanted this family to be honest with each other." A sentence I found almost impressive in its ability to describe an act of public cruelty as a principled stand for transparency. I told her I hoped she'd eventually understand the difference between those two things, and I haven't heard from her since. Grace, remarkably, has become closer to me since, visiting regularly. The kind of family member I never expected to gain out of losing the marriage I thought I'd built. The custody arrangement Denise and I eventually finalized gives Ryan regular scheduled time with our daughter, structured formally enough that there's no ambiguity for either of us to renegotiate emotionally in the moment, which I've come to appreciate more than I expected to. He has, to his credit, shown up consistently for every scheduled visit since our daughter was born, and I've made a deliberate effort not to let my anger at how this began poison the actual parenting relationship he's building with her now. That distinction between the husband who failed me and the father he still gets to be took me longer to separate in my own mind than I expected. But Denise was right when she told me early on that the two things did not have to collapse into each other just because they both involved the same man. I ran into Brooke exactly once since the baby shower at a pharmacy, both of us with infants in car seats, and neither of us said anything beyond a brief, awkward nod. I don't know what she knew, or when she knew it, about the overlap between her pregnancy and mine, and I've decided I don't need that answer to move forward with my own life. Some questions I've learned matter less for closure than they do for staying stuck. I think often about the version of that afternoon where I hadn't found that notification 5 weeks earlier, where Marilyn's announcement had actually landed the way she intended it to, on a woman genuinely blindsided in front of everyone she loved. I don't know how I would have gotten through that room without the 5 weeks. I'd already spent building a floor under myself. I know that whatever grief I felt sitting at that shower, it was a grief I got to feel on my own schedule, privately, in the weeks before, rather than one performed involuntarily in front of 40 witnesses at Marilyn's chosen moment. That distinction, more than anything else, is what I hold on to now. Here's what 10 years of sitting with families in the most vulnerable moments of their lives taught me that nothing else could. People who want to destroy you in public are almost always betting on one specific thing, that you'll be exactly as unprepared as they assume you are. My daughter is 7 months old now, and some days I look at her and think about how close her earliest weeks came to being defined entirely by other people's timing. Marilyn's, Ryan's, even Brooke's, if any one of them had managed to control the moment I found out or the moment I responded. They didn't get to control either. I found out on my own schedule, through my own quiet diligence. And I responded on the same terms, in a room full of people who came expecting to celebrate a baby and left having witnessed something considerably more instructive about what quiet preparation actually looks like. Marilyn spent 5 years quietly building a case for a different life for her son, And she spent 5 weeks believing she still held the only card that mattered. She never once considered that I might already be holding the same card, quietly, calmly for longer than she knew. If this story reminded you that the calmest response is often the one nobody sees coming, share it with somebody who needs to hear that today. Drop a comment, hit subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.